Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Theresa May is having dinner tonight at the Fürstenreichsschule, an old theatre in Salzburg, well known from the closing scenes in The Sound of Music. She's got a 10-minute slot to make her Brexit pitch and convince the EU leaders present to back her Chequers plan. But the path to the summit seems far from clear, with the European Council President, Donald Tusk, warning the UK's proposals will need to be reworked. So how will the EU's major players go about solving a problem like Theresa? Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Salzburg. Gary.
Well, as you say, this is Theresa May's first opportunity to speak directly to all the other EU leaders in the room, to speak, as it were, over the heads of the European Commission, to try and speak to them leader to leader. And she's going to adapt her arguments to make the best of that. One of the things she wants to say is this is a dangerous world. You're a national leader, so am I. We should hug each other close, stay as close as we possibly can, where we can. The other argument I suspect she's going to make, because she's been making it in other media outlets recently, not least in the German press, is how would you, as a leader of a country, like it if your jurisdiction was split in two in some way through a change to the customs union? And she's there talking, of course, about the backstop on Northern Ireland. And she's going to try and appeal to them as countries, some of them have their own nationalist, separatist issues. Would you really like this happening on your doorstep? Do you want this can of worms opened? I don't think she'll put it in explicit language like that, but it's quite clear from the arguments she's made before. She will be putting those arguments in the room. There has been some mood music before this summit that would suggest the two sides were getting closer. That has been the narrative coming out of bits of Whitehall. But the European Commission President, one of the people she's trying to speak over in the room tonight, arrived and said that he thought the two sides were still far away. Maybe they're getting closer and still far away, but there really isn't much time left.
Maybe the healing powers of a cultural capital can do what other gatherings have not. Theresa May has told aides she believes the meeting in Salzburg is critical. A moment when she wants the EU leaders to do what she's already done and soften their negotiating lines.
I believe this is the right proposal because it maintains frictionless trade. It's the only credible and negotiable plan on the table that delivers no hard border in Northern Ireland and also delivers on the vote of the British people. And if we're going to achieve a successful conclusion, then just as the UK has evolved its position, the EU will need to evolve its position too.
Both sides have been growing fearful of no deal and the dangers of adding to instability in dangerous times.
In Austria, we would feel the consequences of an unruly exit. It would have consequences on our economy, but also on jobs in Austria.
All afternoon at Salzburg Airport, private jets spewed out leaders. But has anything really changed in these talks? Could anything change here?
As a curtain raiser to this summit, Michel Barnier, the chief EU negotiator, has talked about using technology to minimise the impact of checks on goods as they flow into the area governed by the EU's rules after Brexit. That's exactly what the British government has been asking for, but the British government was talking about minimising impact on the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Michel Barnier is still talking about Northern Ireland staying under single market and customs union rules. He's talking about checks as goods go across the Irish Sea from Britain.
Well, I welcome the fact that Michel Barnier is recognising the need to find a new solution because the original proposal put forward by the European Commission was unacceptable to us. But what we cannot accept is seeing Northern Ireland carved away from the United Kingdom customs territory.
The other massive outstanding business is, of course, the future relationship post-Brexit. The EU27 still believe Theresa May's plans amount to some kind of smash and grab raid on the EU rules she wants to stick close to, discarding others that she doesn't. What's changed in the run-up to this summit is that on the declaration on the future relationship, in the officials' jargon, they're talking about instead of going low, nailing down all the details, going high, which means keeping the thing pretty woolly, saving the real negotiations for another day. Around Theresa May, some people worry that could agitate already mutinous forces on her own backbenches.
The Irish question, or the framework for economic cooperation, the UK's proposals will need to be reworked and further negotiated. Today there's perhaps more hope, but there is surely less and less time.
But the European Council leader also said he acknowledged that the UK position had undergone a positive evolution. That's a key buzzword. At an earlier summit, the EU said if the UK position evolves, the EU one could too. A timetable is taking shape here. The leaders are expected to agree a mid-November summit at which the deal, in theory, will be wrapped up. But the distances between the two sides remain great, and not everyone wants a broad brush agreement to paper over the cracks.
Well, with me, the leading Eurosceptic Conservative MP John Redwood and the Labour MP Wes Streeting, who supports the People's Vote campaign for a second referendum on whether to leave the EU. John Redwood, the Treasury Minister Mel Stride says that if you chuck Chequers, you'll either halt Brexit or usher in a second referendum.
I don't agree with either of those outcomes. We want either a good deal for our future relationship, or we want to leave and have all the freedoms and get our money back immediately and spend that to provide a big boost to the economy. And it's very difficult to see that a deal will be better. Well, we've offered all sorts of compromises, and the EU is not interested. And we did warn we warned the Prime Minister that we didn't think the Chequers deal would recommend itself to the European Union, let alone to us, and sure enough, it hasn't.
Name one compromise that you as a Brexiteer have offered.
Well, we were prepared to look at a deal which kept us in the EU for a bit longer and all that kind of thing. But having looked at it, I can't see any attraction to it at all. I think it is much better that we have a clean exit, end all the uncertainty. I don't want another 21 months of uncertainty for business where all these arguments go on, and there's still no proper deal. So, and we certainly shouldn't pay them $39 billion for nothing, which is what we would be doing if there is no firm conclusion on the future partnership.
OK, so no second referendum?
No, of course not. No.
Right. Wes Streeting, is there any kind of Brexit that you would go for?
Well, I argued right from the outset that we should accept the result of the referendum and pursue a course of action that protected people's jobs and livelihoods, our strong security cooperation with the European Union and other areas where there's clear common good and common interest.
So actually a watered-down Brexit would suit you just fine?
My fear is looking at the outline of the Chequers deal. I mean, we're in this position where I don't believe it commands a majority of the House of Commons. John Redwood and I will both vote against the Chequers deal for very different reasons. And I think, you know, whether people voted Leave or Remain, they see a Brexit negotiation process going very badly, and a Brexit that will ultimately look very little like the Brexit that people voted for. And for two reasons, I'm advocating a people's vote on the final deal. There's a principled reason, which is if Brexit looks substantially different, people should get the say on the final deal. There's also a pragmatic reason, which is I don't see at the moment how the Prime Minister will be able to break a parliamentary deadlock on this issue, and ultimately she might have to turn to a second vote.
But I don't think there is a parliamentary deadlock. Parliament, in its wisdom, has approved both the EU Withdrawal Notification Act, which sent the letter which does all that we need to do in international law to leave the EU on the 29th of March next year, and it approved by a smaller majority the EU Withdrawal Act, which does everything we need to do in UK law. So Parliament has rightly expressed the view of the British people in the referendum that we are leaving on the 29th of March next year.
But there's no parliamentary
agreement. And that is exactly what we will do.
But there's no parliamentary agreement for any deal that is currently on the...
So we just
or
leave.
No deal. Well, there's no agreement for that either.
Parliament has said we are leaving on the 29th of March, and I do not believe Parliament will then repeal all that and say to the British people, you were wrong and we don't agree with you anymore. Why did Parliament vote that through? Because a lot of people disagree with me in Parliament. They don't have my enthusiasm for how much better off we're going to be out of the EU. They did it, and the Labour Party voted for the Notification Act because they knew that was the will of the British people, and they were right to do so.
This is about the will of the British people.
Well, I mean, there is absolutely no way, though, that a majority of MPs are going to allow the UK to tumble off a cliff at the end of March. You know, the consequences of leaving the European Union with no deal would be catastrophic, John. You know, in terms of people's jobs, livelihoods, the Irish border question.
Look, you said all this about voting no, and you were wrong. You said we're going to have 800,000 job losses losses in the first winter after the vote, and the number of jobs went up. You can't keep on fibbing like this.
No, come on, John. There are very practical issues. You know, you haven't been able to address people's concerns about customs arrangements. It's not clear where you stand on security cooperation with the European Union. And the Irish border question is a very live issue. John Major and Tony Blair both warned about the Irish border issue, and it's an absolute disaster.
On that point, you've had decades to come up with your proposals for what Britain would look like. Well, you didn't.
It's all over my website over the last 3 years.
You decided not to publish it.
And after. No, I published.
Okay, you personally, but we're
plans.
talking about the joint manifesto, not the John Redwood manifesto.
Well, I think you'll find that my colleagues in the ERG have published a lot as well. Ian Duncan-Smith has published a very good thing on borders and migration.
Was pulled. You couldn't come to an agreement.
It is a perfectly clear position, and part of it was published recently about the Northern Ireland border. Watch this space, more will be released. But the position is very clear anyway. It is that leaving without the current withdrawal agreement is much better for Britain because we keep the money and we don't have another 21 months of having to accept all the rules.
The Brexit Secretary says that it's weakening Theresa May's negotiating hand to have the second referendum in the offing.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think at this stage in the process, with the total lack of clarity about where we're going to land on Brexit, I think it's the responsible thing to do now to plan to give people a say on the final deal. I think it's democratic. I think it's pragmatic. And I also think it is very telling. You know, if it was as simple as people suggested, leaving the European Union, then why did Boris Johnson and David Davis fail to make that case around the table at Chequers? The parents of Brexit have abandoned the whole process during childbirth. It's absolutely outrageous, really, that Boris Johnson and David Davis have gotten away with it.
Well, they had an obvious disagreement with the Prime Minister because they think her civil service advisors are quite wrong to try and recreate great chunks of the European Union we voted to leave, when both campaigns agreed that we were leaving the customs union and single market, and were also pointing out, as is proving to be true, that it wasn't negotiable with the EU anyway. So we're just wasting time dealing with the Chequers proposal, which is dead.
Well, you're both against the Chequers proposal. One of you is making a horrible mistake. Which one is it?
Well, and we're both speaking for our views. Wes wants to stay in the European Union and doesn't accept the verdict of the referendum. I've always thought we'd be better off out, and I love the verdict of the referendum. That's the difference.
I mean, I did accept the result of the referendum. That's why I voted to trigger Article 50 to authorise the process. I just think it's been such a disaster, and I'm not prepared to put people's jobs and livelihoods, our national security and our future place in the world at risk.
No, nor am I.
On the basis of a whole prospectus that was promised and cannot be
delivered.
What was promised, that whole prospectus, like the entire base of the Leave campaign, that we'd be able to take back control of our money, our laws and our borders and have economic success.
And that's what we must do by leaving on the 29th of March.
Then where's the plan? Where's, you know, Boris Johnson managed to write 2 articles, one leave, one remain, but he's managed to write a resignation letter, but he's not managed to come up with a manifesto.
It's a great plan. I set out a budget on how we spend all the money. Why doesn't your party want to spend the money at home instead of giving it to the EU? That's a big question.
I'm going to take back control of this debate. Thank you, gentlemen, both very much. John.
A Brexit deal is still far away, according to Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission. He was speaking at the EU summit taking place in Austria, where Theresa May has this evening been presenting her case for a deal based on the plans drawn up by the Cabinet at Chequers earlier this summer. Officials say that there remain serious differences over trade and the future of the Irish border. Mrs May said tonight that the EU needed to show readiness to compromise, as Britain had done. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg has the latest.
Stuck? Looking for a way out? The Prime Minister and other leaders have 8 weeks to agree what happens to Northern Ireland after we leave. Her plan says
it's the only credible and negotiable plan on the table that delivers no hard border in Northern Ireland and also delivers on the vote of the British people. But what we cannot accept is seeing Northern Ireland carved away from the United Kingdom customs territory.
But the EU club's plan is very different. They say Northern Ireland might have to follow EU rules if the big Brexit deal can't be done.
I don't think we're any closer to a withdrawal agreement than we were in March. I can't report any progress at this stage, unfortunately, but we'll keep working on it.
Taoiseach, what happens if the EU doesn't budge on the Brexit border issue in Ireland?
Well, then the United Kingdom shall have to.
Leaders landed to hear the Prime Minister explain those proposals for how we leave, the so-called Chequers deal. They don't much like how parts of our economy would stay closely tied to the EU to guard against disruption. and avoid going back to an old-fashioned border in Ireland like those of years ago.
These talks were always going to be complicated, but at summit after summit, the biggest obstacle always becomes what happens 1,000 miles away or so from here. When we leave the European Union, the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the island will become the line between Europe's huge trading club and another country, the UK, on the outside. And the two sides in the talks have very different ideas over how to handle that change.
And despite lots of chatter about tweaks from the EU negotiator, or tucks at home, there's no question the tussle over the Irish border is a very real block on progress.
Some of Prime Minister May's proposals from Chequers indicate a positive evolution in the UK's approach, as well as a will to minimise the negative effects of Brexit. On other issues, the UK's proposals will need to be reworked and further negotiated. Today there is perhaps more hope, but there is surely less and less time.
The Prime Minister hopes by asking her peers directly, they will budge. They believe in time she'll realise she has to move. But with a time now set for deal day, something or someone will have to give. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Salzburg.
Let's go live to Salzburg tonight, and our Europe editor Katja Adler is there. Katja, we've heard about the case the Prime Minister is trying to make to fellow leaders. What kind of reception is it getting?
Well, Hugh, we did hear from Donald Tusk. He said he's the host of this summit and he's the leader of the European Council. And he said that we're currently now in a very decisive phase of Brexit negotiations. Of course, he's absolutely right, because under EU law, the time allowed for a member state who wants to leave and negotiate its departure is fast running out. So the leaders here tonight want to hear from Theresa May what arguments she can have. She's speaking to them for 10 minutes tonight, and it's really what we're witnessing now, as the backs are firmly going against the wall, is a big game of chicken, with each side convinced that the other is going to back down first. EU leaders here tonight believe that they hold all the cards, but Theresa May has a big cards to play, and she's waving it at this summit as well, and that is the threat of a no deal. She says on those big sticking points, the Irish border and the nature of the future economic relations after Brexit between the EU and the UK, you have to come towards me or there could be no deal at all this autumn. She knows the EU wants a deal because a no deal scenario would be extremely expensive and chaotic for EU businesses as much as the UK's. But as this Brexit plot thickens, Hugh, what I'm hearing from her EU peers tonight is that they are willing to call the Prime Minister's bluff.
Katja, once again, many thanks. Katja Adler there with the latest at that summit in Salzburg.
Everyone's trying to be positive, but the brutal reality is that what we're told is the irresistible force of Brexit is meeting the immovable object of the Northern Ireland backstop. And so far, neither has given way. Chief negotiator Michel Barnier made some gestures of goodwill last night, trying, as he put it, to de-dramatise the situation. But as Theresa May arrived in Salzburg this evening, she made it clear it isn't minor adjustments Britain is looking for, it's the principle that's wrong.
We've always recognised that there are unique circumstances that apply in Northern Ireland, for example, in relation to checks for some agricultural projects. But what we cannot accept is seeing Northern Ireland carved away from the United Kingdom customs territory, because regardless of where the checks would be, what that would mean would be that it would be a challenge to our constitutional and economic integrity.
She will deliver this message and warn her fellow leaders not to cling to hopes that Brexit may be reversed in a second referendum at dinner this evening. They will be polite enough not to reject out of hand her Chequers plan, but she's been told in no uncertain terms that a deal will require Britain moving a lot further.
On other issues, such as the Irish question or the framework for economic cooperation, the UK's proposals will need to be reworked and further negotiated.
Mrs May will only have 10 minutes or so to make her case over dinner tonight. And in keeping with the strict rule that Brexit will not be negotiated by leaders but only by the Commission, they will not respond directly. But the message all afternoon here was that EU unity remains solid, and however untenable it may be among her own party, further compromise will be required.
We want to do everything possible to avoid a hard Brexit. We stand ready to compromise, but we also expect that from the UK, and so I hope that in her speech today, we will hear a step forward.
We're in the twilight of these Brexit talks. If there's agreement on one thing, it's that the haggling must be done by mid-November. Just a couple of these big meetings left before everyone ends up in unknown and dangerous territory.
James, so much now rests on resolving that Irish border issue. What hope, in your view, is there, even at this late stage?
Well, it's not easy to see where the middle ground is, Alistair, and to explain why, let's go back to the beginning of this in December, where Mrs May agreed the principle that if there wasn't going to be any other better agreement, there would be no hard border on the island of Ireland. Now, the EU and Dublin interpreted that to mean that therefore, Northern Ireland must stay in a customs union with the rest of the EU, effectively putting a customs border down the Irish Sea. Now, Mrs May has always said no British Prime Minister could ever agree to that. And the Chequers plan was designed to get around that problem by keeping Britain so close to the EU that there wouldn't be a need for that border. But even if the EU were to accept Chequers in its entirety, would she get it through Parliament? Well, David Davis, former Brexit Secretary, said today that she wouldn't. Her own party isn't behind it. And of course, the EU is not going to accept it in its entirety. They want a lot more movement from Mrs May and have absolutely stuck to the line that without a deal on the backstop, there will be no withdrawal agreement. In other words, no deal. And so that's where they are tonight. They have a summit in October and then another special summit in November to try and find some way around this. If they fail then we really may be in for some interesting times.
Interesting indeed. James, thank you.
The Prime Minister is roundabout now finishing up dinner in Salzburg with a speech to the EU 27. Tonight she spelled out that to them delaying or extending the negotiations would not be an option. I know, she told them, that for many of you Brexit's not something you want, but it is important to be clear there will be no second referendum in the UK. Her response to the movement of the so-called People's Vote and her own former Transport Minister who are fighting to give the British public a say on that final deal. Well, our political editor Nick Watt is in Salzburg for us tonight. Just, Nick, talk us through the tone of her speech, first of all.
Well, most importantly, it was an absolutely stunning location for this dinner. The Felsenreitschule Theatre in Salzburg normally hosts the Salzburg Music Festival, and fans of the sound of the music will know that that is where the Von Trapp family gave their last concert. Now, it was a pretty wary Theresa May who walked into that theatre. She should be speaking about now, and she's essentially saying, listen to me. I have taken massive political risks. I've lost 2 cabinet ministers over the Chequers proposal. Over to you. You need to move. And she's essentially saying, as you were saying there, we cannot allow these talks to drag out beyond November. And you may have heard this talk about extending Article 50 to allow a second referendum. No to an extension of Article 50. No to a second referendum. And the Prime Minister believes there is a little bit of space for her here to say this sort of message, to give this sort of message, because there are some EU leaders who are saying that if they get Theresa May into the wrong place, they could end up with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. And he really does strike fear into the hearts of many EU leaders.
So you've given us a little hint of what some of them are thinking, but how do you think today's speech went down there?
Well, I mean, there is certainly a feeling of reasonably good mood music. There's a feeling that Theresa May really did engage in this process with her Chequers proposal. And Donald Tusk, the European Council President, is saying that we need time, so let's look forward about going forward towards November. That should be the final deadline. But on the substance, they are saying that Theresa May's plan for the future trading relationship, that's half in, half out of the single market, no to that. They're saying on Northern Ireland, the EU does believe it'll have to have those hugely controversial checks down the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland to ensure no hard border in Northern Ireland if Theresa May sticks to her red lines. To which Theresa May says that would threaten the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. So really where I think we are tonight is the mood music is not bad, but on the substance, it's stalemate.
Nick, thanks very much indeed.